The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the soccer field as the game unfolded beneath it. Jack Davis stood on the sidelines, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on his team struggling on the pitch. He'd seen this before, a team losing steam, disorganized, missing every chance. But today, it wasn't just a game that gnawed at him. There was something heavier in the air, something that tightened in his chest with every minute that passed. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Mr. Connors, the club's president, making his way down from the stands with two board members trailing behind him. Jack's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. Connors never came down during a game, and certainly not with board members in tow. The crowd began to buzz as they too noticed the men approaching the sidelines. "Jack!" Connors called out, his voice sharp and cutting through the noise of the game. The players continued to run, but it was clear their focus was starting to shift. Jack turned, his brow furrowed. "Now's not a good time," Jack muttered, his eyes flicking between the game and Connors. But Connors wasn't listening. He was already stepping onto grass, straightening his suit jacket as if preparing for something big. Jack's stomach dropped. "Jack!" Connors began, his voice loud enough for the nearby fans and even the players to hear. "We've made a decision." Jack's heart sank. "Not here. Not like this." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as Connors continued. "The club needs fresh leadership. Someone who can bring in new ideas and a modern approach. We've decided it's time for you to step aside." The words hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. Jack felt the world tilt slightly, his knees weak. He blinked, trying to process what was happening. But Connors was relentless. "You've done great things for this club, Jack, but it's time for a change," Connors said, his tone cold, emotionless. "There's a new coach ready to take over, effective immediately." The crowd had fallen silent, eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Jack's players stood frozen, unsure what to do, the ball rolling slowly to a stop at midfield. Jack's jaw tightened. "You're doing this now? In the middle of a game?" Connors shrugged, as if it were no big deal. "There's no point in dragging this out. You've had your time. We're moving forward." The humiliation was suffocating. 30 years of loyalty, dedication, and hard work, all stripped away in front of his team, the fans, and the entire stadium. Jack looked at his players, who were standing in disbelief, unsure if they should keep playing or walk off the field with him. Behind Connors, a younger man in a sleek tracksuit stood waiting. Jack hadn't noticed him before, but now it was clear. This was a new coach, the fresh face that Connors had deemed necessary for the future of the club. Jack clenched his fists, his face burning with anger and shame. He had given his life to this team, to this sport, and now he was being shoved aside like an old piece of equipment, useless and outdated. But what could he do? The decision had already been made. The crowd was watching, waiting for his reaction, some out of sympathy, others out of curiosity to see how the old coach would handle the public humiliation. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Without a word, Jack turned and started walking toward the tunnel, his footsteps heavy, his heart even heavier. As he made his way off the field, he could hear the scattered applause from the fans. Not for him, but for the new coach who was already stepping forward to take his place. "Good luck, Jack," Connors called after him, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You'll need it." Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. Not after this. The front door creaked as Jack stepped into his house, the quiet settling around him like a weight. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen table and shrugged off his jacket, letting it drop carelessly onto the back of a chair. His house had always been a sanctuary, a place of pride and comfort. But tonight, it felt like just another reminder of what he had lost. The walls were lined with photographs, trophies, and framed jerseys, memories of the glory days. There was the picture of him holding the championship cup high above his head, the one where the whole town had celebrated like they'd never celebrated before. Next to it, a snapshot of him standing on the sidelines, directing his team with intensity, his face alive with purpose. Now, all of it felt like it belonged to someone else. someone younger, someone with more to give. Jack walked slowly past the trophies, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the plaques. Once, these had meant everything to him. They were symbols of years of hard work, of victories earned through sweat, pain, and sacrifice. But now, they just seemed to mock him, reminders of a past that he could never get back. He stood in front of one photo longer than the others. It was from his first year as head coach, back when the team had been nothing more than a scrappy group of underdogs. He had taken them all the way to the finals that year. No one had believed they could do it, but Jack had. That was the kind of coach he had been, relentless, never backing down from a challenge. But now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Jack slumped down into his old armchair, the cushions sagging under his weight. He stared blankly at the television, not really seeing the game that was playing on the screen. All he could think about was how Connors had humiliated him. How could they do that? After everything he had done for the club, for the team, to be cast aside like he was nothing? He shook his head, trying to shake off the anger, but it lingered, simmering just beneath the surface. Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands gripping the sides of his head as if he could physically squeeze out the frustration. What was he supposed to do now? Football had been his life. It was all he knew. Without it, what was left? He had no idea how to be anything other than a coach. The house creaked as the wind picked up outside, the sound reminding him of how empty it felt now. Without the routines, the practices, the games, the silence was deafening. Jack rubbed his tired eyes and let out a long breath. For a brief moment, he considered calling up one of the board members. Maybe he could reason with them, explain why he still had something to offer, why they were wrong to push him out. But the thought quickly faded. No. Connors had made it clear his time was up. They wanted someone younger, someone with fresh ideas. Jack wasn't that guy anymore. He wasn't sure what he was. The clock on the wall ticked, each second marking the slow passage of a night that seemed to stretch on forever. Jack glanced back at the trophies one last time before standing up, feeling the stiffness in his legs from years spent on the sidelines. The question still lingered in his mind, heavy and unanswerable. What now? The next few days passed in a blur of emptiness. Jack filled the hours with small, meaningless tasks. Cleaning out the garage, mowing the lawn, organizing old papers, but nothing seemed to fill the void. He'd been stripped of his purpose, and no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the silence always crept back in. On the third day after his public dismissal, Jack sat in his living room, staring blankly at a sports magazine he wasn't really reading. His thoughts wandered, as they always did now, back to the field, to the team, to the humiliating way it had all ended. The sudden knock at the door startled him. He hadn't been expecting anyone. Slowly, he got up, his body stiff from hours spent in the same position, and shuffled toward the door. When he opened it, he found a young boy standing on the porch, nervously fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "Coach Davis?" the boy asked, his voice unsure but respectful. Jack blinked, momentarily thrown by the title. Coach Davis. It had been only a few days, but it felt like a lifetime since anyone had called him that. "Yeah, that's me," Jack said, though the words didn't feel as natural as they used to. "I'm Tommy," the boy said, sticking out a hand. Jack shook it, noting the kid's firm grip despite his obvious nerves. I play for the youth team in town. Well, sort of. Sort of." Jack raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "Yeah, we don't really have a coach right now. Our last one left, and we've been trying to run things ourselves, but..." Tommy's voice trailed off, his shoulders slumping. "It's not going well." Jack crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And you're telling me this because..." Tommy straightened up a little, determination flashing in his eyes. "Because we need a coach. A real coach. I mean, we know who you are. Everyone knows what you've done for the club. We were thinking, maybe, you could help us out." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. Him, Coaching a bunch of kids on a youth team, he hadn't coached at that level in decades. These kids weren't professionals. They weren't even close. And after everything that had happened, did he really have it in him? I don't know if that's a good idea, Jack said finally, shaking his head. I'm not in the best place right now, kid. Tommy's face fell, but he didn't back down. Please, coach. We're not asking for much. Just a few pointers, maybe a couple of practices. We're not expecting you to stick around if you don't want to. But we need someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who knows how to win. The sincerity in the boy's voice hit Jack harder than he expected. There was something familiar in the way Tommy spoke. The same fire, the same hunger for success that Jack had once felt. It stirred something inside him, something he thought he had lost. Still, he hesitated. I don't know if I'm the right guy for this. Tommy's eyes pleaded with him. Just come to one practice. One. If you don't want to stay after that, we'll understand. But we could really use your help. Jack looked down at the boy, then out past his driveway to the quiet street beyond. He hadn't set foot on a field since that day, and the thought of going back, of putting himself in front of players, even if they were just kids, made his stomach churn. But at the same time, the idea of sitting in his empty house for another week, with nothing but the ghosts of his past victories to keep him company, felt unbearable. One practice, Jack said slowly, still unsure if he meant it. I'll come to one practice. Tommy's face lit up with a smile, so wide it almost caught Jack off guard. Thank you, coach. Thank you. You won't regret it, I promise. Jack watched as the boy ran off, his excitement contagious. As the door clicked shut behind him, Jack sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. One practice, he thought. What harm could it do? But deep down, Jack knew this was more than just a practice. It was a step back into the world he had once known, a world he wasn't sure he was ready to face again. The sun hung low in the sky as Jack pulled up to the community field. It was nothing like the stadiums he had grown accustomed to, just a small patch of grass surrounded by a few benches and a wire fence. A handful of kids, no more than 15 or 16 years old, were scattered across the field, half-heartedly kicking a ball around. Jack killed the engine and sat in his car for a moment, watching them. He wasn't sure why he had agreed to this. Maybe it was the way Tommy had looked at him, or maybe it was the loneliness that had crept in over the last few days. Either way, he was here now, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Jack grabbed his jacket and stepped out of the car. As he walked toward the field, the kids began to notice him, their eyes widening as they recognized who he was. Tommy spotted him from across the field and jogged over, a wide grin on his face. Coach Davis, you came. Tommy's voice was filled with excitement, and Jack couldn't help but smile a little, despite his lingering doubts. I said I would, didn't I? Jack replied, trying to keep his tone light. The other boys gathered around, whispering to each other as they stole glances at Jack. He could feel their curiosity and anticipation hanging in the air. They weren't used to having someone like him around, someone who had coached at the highest level. So, this is the team? Jack asked, looking around at the group. Tommy nodded. Yeah, well, we're still figuring things out, but we've got potential. We just need some direction. Jack raised an eyebrow. Direction. That had been his specialty once. Back in the day, he could whip any team into shape, no matter how rough around the edges they were. But these weren't professional players. They were just kids, playing for the love of the game. He took a deep breath and glanced at the ball rolling aimlessly across the grass. All right, he said finally. Let's see what you've got. Start with a scrimmage. I want to see how you play. The boys scrambled to set up teams, and within minutes, the game was underway. Jack stood on the sideline, arms crossed, watching intently. The play was sloppy, the passes were weak, and there was no real communication between them. But despite the mess, Jack saw something beneath the surface. Potential. They were rough, sure, but there was passion in the way they played. A hunger to prove themselves. As the game dragged on, Jack found himself getting more and more involved. He started calling out instructions, urging them to push harder, to make smarter decisions. His voice, one so familiar in this role, felt strange at first, but soon it came naturally, like slipping back into an old pair of shoes. "Tommy, switch the play. Open up the space," Jack shouted, stepping closer to the field. Tommy looked up, surprised at the command, but quickly obeyed. The ball was passed across the field, opening up an opportunity that the boys hadn't seen before. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The more Jack watched, the more he felt that old spark flicker to life inside him. These kids weren't like the professional athletes he had trained for years, but they had something those players didn't, a raw, unpolished drive to succeed. And that was something he could work with. After about an hour, Jack blew the whistle he had brought with him, signaling the end of the scrimmage. The boys, panting and sweating, gathered around him, their eyes eager for feedback. "Well," Jack began, pacing in front of them, "it's not great. You're all over the place, and there's no communication. But I see potential." The boys looked at each other, exchanging hopeful glances. Jack continued, "You're rough, but you've got the heart for it. That's a start. We can work with that." Tommy beamed. "So, does that mean you'll keep coaching us?" Jack hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision. He hadn't planned on staying past a day, but something about being out here, working with these kids, had reignited a part of him he thought was long gone. "Yeah," Jack said, finally nodding. "I'll stick around for a while. Let's see what we can do." The boys erupted in cheers, their excitement contagious. Jack couldn't help but smile. For the first time in days, he felt like he had a purpose again, something to work toward, something that mattered. As the boys gathered their gear and started heading off the field, Tommy lingered for a moment, looking up at Jack. "Thanks, Coach. We really needed this," Tommy said softly. Jack nodded, watching the sunset over the field. "So did I, kid. So did I." It didn't take long for Jack to settle into his new role with the youth team. Practices became a regular thing, and each session brought out more of the old coach in him. The boys were improving, little by little, and Jack found himself enjoying the work in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't the same as coaching at the professional level, but there was something satisfying about helping these kids grow, both as players and as people. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of Jack's mind. Something wasn't right. One afternoon, as practice was winding down, Tommy jogged over to Jack, his face serious. "Coach, can I talk to you for a second?" Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead with a towel and nodded. "What's on your mind, kid?" Tommy hesitated, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. "It's about the team and the league fees." Jack frowned. He hadn't heard much about the finances since he started helping out, but he had assumed things were in order. "What about the fees?" "Well, we haven't been able to pay them yet," Tommy said quietly. "We've been scraping by, but we don't have enough to keep going. If we don't pay by the end of the month, we're out." Jack felt his stomach drop. "How much do you need?" Tommy sighed. "A lot. Way more than we have. We've tried fundraising, but it's not enough." The weight of the situation hit Jack hard. These kids had been working so hard, putting in the effort, improving every day. And now, because of money, it could all come crashing down. Jack had seen this kind of thing before. Talented young players losing their chance because of things beyond their control. It wasn't fair. Jack clenched his jaw, frustrated by the situation. "Let me make some calls," he said finally. "Maybe there's something we can do." Tommy nodded, his eyes hopeful but unsure. "Thanks, Coach. I know it's a lot to ask." Jack waved him off. "Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out." But as the boys packed up their gear and headed off the field, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't let these kids down, not after everything they'd been through. The next day, Jack sat at his kitchen table, his phone in front of him. He had made a few calls, reached out to some contacts, but nothing had come through. The money just wasn't there. He was running out of options. And then the doorbell rang. Jack got up and opened the door to find a familiar face. Ryan Keller, one of his former players from years ago. Ryan had been one of Jack's most promising talents back in the day, a kid with raw skill and determination. Jack had helped shape him into a star, and now Ryan was one of the top players in the professional league. "Ryan," Jack said, surprised but pleased. "What brings you here?" Ryan grinned, stepping inside. "I heard you were back in the coaching game, old man. Thought I'd come by and see for myself." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Not quite the big leagues anymore, but yeah, I'm helping out with the local youth team." Ryan's face grew serious. "I heard about the trouble you're in, with the league fees and all." Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, it's a mess. I don't know what we're going to do." Ryan nodded, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I owe you, Jack. You know that, right? I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for you. You taught me everything I know about this game." Jack waved him off. "You were always talented, Ryan. I just helped guide you." Ryan shook his head. "No, Jack. You did more than that. You believed in me when no one else did. That's why I'm here." Jack frowned, not sure where this was going. Ryan pulled out a checkbook and started writing. "I'm going to cover the fees. All of it. The team stays in the league." Jack blinked, stunned. "Ryan, you don't have to do that." "I know I don't," Ryan interrupted, handing the check to Jack. "But I want to consider it a small thank you for everything you did for me." Jack stared at the check in disbelief. It was more than enough to cover the fees, and then some. "I don't know what to say." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Jack. These kids need you, just like I did." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, nodding. "Thanks, Ryan. I won't forget this." Ryan smiled and made his way to the door. "I'll be around if you need anything else. Keep in touch, all right?" Jack watched him go, the weight on his chest lifting for the first time in days. As he looked down at the check in his hand, he realized something. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the impact he had made on people's lives. An impact that went far beyond the game. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as done with coaching as he had thought. With the team's financial crisis now behind them, Jack threw himself back into coaching with renewed energy. Practices became more intense, more structured, and the boys responded. Each day, they improved, working harder, playing smarter, and for the first time, Jack began to believe that they could actually make something of themselves. They weren't just a ragtag group of kids anymore. They were becoming a real team. But even with the team on the rise, something still nagged at Jack. He knew this couldn't last forever. The league fees had been paid, but there were other costs, other challenges that would come up down the line. He couldn't rely on favors from old players forever. They needed something more stable, something long-lasting. One afternoon, after wrapping up practice, Jack was approached by an unfamiliar face. A tall man, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing a confident smile, stood at the edge of the field, watching the boys as they packed up their gear. "Coach Davis?" the man asked, stepping forward and extending a hand. "I've been looking for you." Jack shook his hand, eyeing him warily. "Can I help you with something?" The man smiled, clearly used to getting what he wanted. "My name is Daniel Harper. I represent a group of investors who are very interested in what you're doing here." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Investors? What would a bunch of investors want with a youth soccer team?" Daniel chuckled, looking out at the field. "It's not just about the team, coach. It's about what you represent. Your story, your legacy, it's valuable." Jack frowned, unsure where this was going. "What are you getting at?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, handing it to Jack. "We've been watching what you've done with these boys. how you took them from a struggling group to a competitive team. And we think there's potential here, more than just a youth team. We want to help you take this further." Jack looked at the card, then back at Daniel. "Take it further? What exactly does that mean?" Daniel's smile widened. "We're talking about a full-scale program, Coach. A sports academy. A place where you can train not just young boys, but kids from all over, boys and girls, from all kinds of backgrounds. You'll have the resources you need, the facilities, the staff, everything you need to build something bigger than just a local team." Jack blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. "An academy? You're serious?" "Very," Daniel said, nodding. "We've already secured the funding. All we need is someone to lead it. Someone with your experience, your passion. You're the perfect person for the job." Jack shook his head slowly, trying to process what he was hearing. An academy? A full program? It sounded too good to be true. Why me? Why now? Daniel's eyes softened. "Because, Jack, people like you don't come around often. You've dedicated your life to this sport, and you've proven that you can shape young minds. Teach them more than just a game. We want to give you the platform to do that on a much bigger scale." Jack's mind raced. It was an incredible offer, one he never would have dreamed of. But at the same time, the doubts crept in. Could he really handle something like this? After everything that had happened with the club, after the way Connors had humiliated him, could he trust himself to take on such a huge responsibility? I don't know," Jack said finally, his voice quiet. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for something like this." Daniel stepped closer, his tone soft but firm. "You're exactly the right person, Jack. The question is, do you believe in yourself enough to see it?" Jack felt the weight of the question settle on him. It wasn't just about running an academy. It was about whether he still had the fire inside him, the drive to make a real difference. He had always been a coach, a leader, but after everything that had happened, after being tossed aside by the club, he wasn't sure if he could trust himself anymore. "I'll need some time to think about it," Jack said, slipping the card into his pocket. Daniel nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. This opportunity won't wait forever." Jack watched as Daniel walked away, disappearing into the parking lot. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the empty field, his mind churning with thoughts. An academy, a chance to build something lasting, something bigger than he had ever imagined. It was everything he had ever wanted, but now that it was in front of him, the fear of failing, of letting people down, gnawed at him. Later that night, Jack sat in his living room, staring at the business card in his hand. He knew this was a crossroads, a moment that could change everything. The old Jack, the Jack who had built a team from nothing and turned it into champions, would have jumped at the chance. But now he wasn't sure if that guy still existed. He placed the card on the table and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Maybe it was time to find out. The day of the tournament final arrived sooner than Jack had expected. The energy on the field was electric as the boys warmed up, running drills and practicing their passes. This was the moment they had worked for, the culmination of weeks of hard training and hard-won victories. For Jack, it was more than just a game. It was a chance for redemption, a way to prove, not to the world but to himself, that he still had what it took. The stands were fuller than Jack had ever seen them for a youth game. Parents, neighbors, and even a few familiar faces from around town had come to watch. Among them was Daniel Harper, the investor who had made the proposal about the academy. Jack spotted him in the crowd, standing with his arms crossed, watching the team intently. The sight of him only heightened the pressure that was already weighing on Jack's shoulders. As the boys huddled together before the game, Tommy looked up at Jack, his face serious. "We're ready, Coach. We're gonna win this." Jack gave him a nod, though inside, his stomach churned with nerves. "Just remember what we've worked on. Play smart, play together. Don't try to do it all on your own. Trust each other." The boys nodded in unison, their confidence palpable. Jack took a deep breath. Stepping back, as they broke the huddle and took their positions on the field. This was it. The first half of the game was brutal. The opposing team was fast, aggressive, and organized. Every time Jack's boys tried to make a move, the other team shut them down. By halftime, they were down by 2 goals, and the energy on the field was starting to fade. Jack paced the sidelines, frustration building with each minute that passed. His players were giving everything they had, but it wasn't enough. He could see it in their faces as they trudged toward the bench, sweat dripping from their brows, shoulders slumped in defeat. As they gathered around him during the break, Jack could feel the weight of their disappointment. They had come so far, worked so hard, and now it was slipping away. "I know it's tough," Jack began, his voice steady, though inside he was just as shaken as they were. "But you can't give up now. This game isn't over. You're down, but you're not out." Tommy, sitting on the bench with his head in his hands, looked up. "They're too good, coach. We can't get through their defense." Jack crouched down in front of him, meeting his eyes. "Yes, you can. You just have to play smarter. They're fast, but they're predictable. We've seen this before. You know how to break them down. You've done it in practice." He stood and looked at the rest of the boys. "This is your game. You've earned the right to be here. Now go out there and take it." The boys nodded, their spirits lifting a little. Jack could see the fire reigniting in their eyes, the determination that had carried them this far. They weren't done yet. As the second half began, Jack made some adjustments, shifting players around and changing the formation. He called Tommy over, his most reliable player. "I need you to play deeper, pull their defense out of position. It's going to leave some space behind them, and when it does, we strike." Tommy nodded, understanding. Jack had trained him for this moment, for the kind of tactical thinking that could turn a game around. As Tommy took his position, Jack could feel the tension building. Everything was riding on this. The first few minutes of the second half were a grind, but slowly, things began to shift. Tommy played deeper, just as Jack had asked, and the opposing defense started to spread, trying to cover more ground. The moment Jack had been waiting for came when one of the opposing defenders overcommit, leaving a gap in the backline. "Now!" Jack shouted from the sidelines. Tommy saw the opening and sent a perfect through ball into the space behind the defense. One of Jack's forwards sprinted into the gap, collected the ball, and fired it into the back of the net. The crowd erupted in cheers as the boys ran back to the halfway line, energized by the goal. They were back in the game. The momentum had shifted, and Jack's team capitalized on it. They pressed harder, moving the ball faster, working as a unit. With 10 minutes left on the clock, they scored the equalizer, and the tension in the stadium reached its peak. Jack stood on the sidelines, his heart racing. This was it, the final push. His boys had fought their way back, but now they needed one more moment of brilliance. With just minutes remaining, the chance came. Tommy picked up the ball at midfield and drove forward, his eyes scanning the field. He saw the opening, a tiny window of opportunity, and he took it. A perfectly timed pass to the winger, who cut inside and slotted the ball into the net. The whistle blew, and the game was over. Jack's team had won. The crowd erupted into cheers, parents rushing down from the stands to hug their kids. Jack stood back, watching the scene unfold, a smile slowly spreading across his face. The boys were jumping up and down, celebrating their victory, their hard work finally paying off. As Tommy ran over, grinning from ear to ear, Jack pulled him into a hug. "You did it, kid. You did it." Tommy looked up at him, still beaming. "No, coach. We did it." Jack felt the lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, nodding. "Yeah, we did." As the team celebrated around him, Jack glanced over at Daniel Harper, who was standing in the crowd, watching with a satisfied smile. The academy, the future, it was all within reach now. But more importantly, Jack had found something in himself that he thought had been lost forever. He wasn't just a coach. He was a mentor, a leader, and he still had something to give. The days following the final game were a whirlwind of celebration and gratitude. The boys were local heroes, and everywhere Jack went, people congratulated him for turning the team around. The victory had breathed new life into the community, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had found his purpose again, not in winning trophies, but in guiding these young players, helping them discover their potential. But even amid the excitement, one question still lingered in Jack's mind. What would come next? The team had succeeded, but there were still challenges ahead. He couldn't keep doing this on his own, and deep down, he knew that the opportunity Daniel Harper had presented to him wasn't just a lifeline for the team. It was a lifeline for him, too. One afternoon, Jack sat at his kitchen table, the card Daniel had given him weeks ago still resting there. He picked it up and stared at it, the words Harper Investments bold and clear. An academy, a chance to do something bigger, to build something that would last long after he was gone. The thought scared him. It was a huge responsibility, and the doubt still lingered. Could he really lead something like that? Could he trust himself not to fail again? The knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Jack stood up, setting the card down as he walked to the door. When he opened it, he wasn't surprised to see Daniel standing there, his familiar, confident smile in place. "Coach Davis," Daniel greeted him, extending a hand. "I thought I'd drop by and see how you're feeling after the big win." Jack shook his hand and stepped aside, letting Daniel in. "We're still riding the high of it, that's for sure," Jack said with a small smile. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the photos and trophies that lined the walls. "You've built something special here, Jack. Something that goes beyond just a game." Jack sighed, crossing his arms. "That's what it's always been about. The game's important, but it's the lives you touch along the way that really matter." Daniel smiled, nodding in agreement. "That's exactly why we want you to lead this academy. You have the heart, the experience, and the wisdom to make it something extraordinary. You can take what you've done here and scale it, reach even more kids." Jack leaned back against the counter, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders. "It's a lot to think about, Daniel. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I'm not sure I'm cut out for something like this." Daniel stepped closer, his expression softening. "I understand, Jack. It's a big decision, but think about what you've accomplished. You turned this team around when no one else believed in them. You've shown them what they're capable of, and they'll carry that with them for the rest of their lives." Jack looked down, the words sinking in. "This academy isn't just about football," Daniel continued. "It's about giving kids from all backgrounds the chance to find their path, just like you did for these boys. You'll have the resources, the support, and most importantly, the opportunity to make a lasting impact." Jack was quiet for a long moment, the memories of the past weeks flashing through his mind, the struggles, the triumphs, the moment of victory on that field. He had found something again, something he thought he'd lost after being humiliated and cast aside by the club. And now, he had a chance to take that spark and turn it into something more. Slowly, Jack nodded. "All right, let's do it." Daniel's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "You won't regret it, Jack. We'll get everything set up. We'll start small, but we'll build it into something incredible." Jack felt the weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about football anymore. It was about giving back, about creating something that would live on long after he was gone. A few weeks later, Jack stood in front of the new academy building, the sun shining brightly overhead. The facility wasn't huge, but it was a start. The fields were freshly laid out, the equipment brand new. It was a place where dreams could be built, where young players would have the chance to learn, grow, and discover their own potential. Tommy and a few of the boys from his team were there, along with their families, beaming with pride as they saw the new facility. Jack couldn't help but smile as he watched them, knowing that this was just the beginning. As he stood there, looking out at the field, Jack felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had been through so much: humiliation, self-doubt, the fear of being forgotten. But now, He knew that his legacy wasn't in the trophies or the wins. It was in the lives he had touched, the players he had helped shape, and the future he was now building. He had found his purpose again, and this time, it was one that would last. Jack Davis's story is one of redemption, purpose, and legacy. From being humiliated and discarded, he found his way back to what mattered most, helping others discover their own potential through the ups and downs. Jack learned that the true measure of success isn't in victories, but in the lives you change along the way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming obstacles through sports, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content like this. And we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when sports helped you overcome a challenge or break through a barrier in your life. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire others with the power of sports. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who could use a little extra motivation today.